Hey, you're listening to On the Payroll, my podcast about project management, consulting, project delivery on platforms such as Salesforce and Microsoft CE. Things such as leadership and team building also interest me a lot. And basically, this is just an opportunity for me to talk to people that I like about topics that fascinate us. In today's episode, I talked to Tokeer Ahmed. We worked together briefly in Capgemini and we've done some projects together, and he is the head of functional consulting at Cap. And we have such a great conversation because we talk the same language. We talk about discovery and how very, very important it is in making sure that a project runs well. And I think you'll find a lot of things that's going to be very useful, especially if you're in the Salesforce business analysis arena. I really hope you'll enjoy this. Thanks a lot. Hello, Talk. Welcome to my podcast on the payroll. How are you today?
I'm really good, thank you, Pei, and thank you very much for having me on.
I'm actually quite excited to see you because I haven't seen you in quite a while, even though we've kind of connected every so often on LinkedIn, but we worked together at Cap and I really enjoyed working with you.
Yeah, likewise.
But let me allow you the opportunity to get into it, because just as I start every podcast is I'm very interested in my guests. And the first place to begin is tell me about your journey, about your career and how you got to where you are today, which is head of the UK functional Salesforce division within Capgemini.
Yeah. So I guess, Pei, if I take it back to when I graduated, right? So I graduated in 2004 with a degree in computer science. And it was probably a lot different back in 2004. But yeah, so new graduate looking for opportunities, in the kind of IT industry, in this sector, etc. And I happened to actually apply for lots and lots of jobs, just like all graduates do. Got a fair bit of rejections, got a few interviews, and eventually I ended up working for Stanley Black & Decker. Mm-hmm. So they're the tooling company,
Power
right?
Tools.
That's it. Yeah. So it was their kind of internal IT department at a plant that was based in Birmingham, which is, from my accent, you can probably tell that that's where I'm from, right? So internal IT team, and I was primarily doing kind of tech support, right? So that's how I spent my initial couple of years, kind of doing that kind of day-to-day tech support, software, hardware, and there was a lot more hardware back then as well, as opposed to now, right? So lots of like kit to look after. And then I guess a couple of years into the role, I started to go more towards a kind of like analyst type role. So it was like tech support and like analysts, and started looking at some of their systems that they used, internally. Now, the story goes with Salesforce is that there was a guy that worked in the same company, in the same department, right? And he was going to look after this implementation of this snazzy new CRM tool, right? And he was going to be, I guess the company was split across Europe, and we had various departments across all of Europe, right? So he was going to look after the Salesforce kind of implementation for just the UK, right? And the story goes that a month before the project was about to kick off, the guy decided to leave the company, right? Which at that point, the powers that be at that company said, oh, Tuck, actually, you wanted to get more involved from like a, a kind of software, business change perspective. This was one of your things that you were talking about around career progression. How do you feel about doing this? And I was like, straight on it, brilliant, absolutely. I would love to do it. So that's kind of how I got on board, not having any idea what Salesforce was, etc. So it was a very kind of, I guess the learning curve was quite intense, because I had to really get up to speed around what Salesforce was. And back then it was primarily Sales Cloud. So we're looking at 2007. And it was primarily a Sales Cloud implementation. So yeah, that's how I kind of got into Salesforce. I ended up being the Salesforce administrator, and I also ended up implementing our I guess functionality to some of all the other European countries as well within that company. So I ended up owning quite a lot of the Salesforce implementation in that company, which probably leads me to like around 2011. So spent about 3 or 4 years kind of owning that implementation, and then unfortunately they decided to close that particular plant in Birmingham. So I was coming up to like a redundancy essentially, right? And then I guess it's weird, right? How I sometimes think of the film Sliding Doors with Gwyneth Paltrow, because it's always really weird how certain decisions that you make in your life can then sometimes, the consequences are like very different, right? Because so there was this random call that happened, and it was late 2011 when somebody called me and basically said, look, Salesforce is like a really boom market at the moment. We can see that you are a Salesforce admin, but what we're finding is a lot of Salesforce admins are actually looking to become consultants as well, right? So how do you feel about going into consultancy? And I was quite nervous, right? Because I thought, well, I know the product, I can deal with the product, etc. I'm not quite sure about, like implementing it on from a consultancy perspective. So I guess long story short, that's how my journey with Capgemini began. So it was in 2012, successfully got in as a I would say almost a junior kind of consultant in 2012, and then started working with like helping clients to actually implement Salesforce. And I think the naivety back then was that I think back then I did not realize that all the skills and all I guess my kind of communication skills that I've got, and my kind of appetite to kind of help people, etc. All that I used to do right back in my previous role. And I think the naivety back then was that how easy it was to translate that into a consultancy, right? Because what I actually found out quite quickly was actually I've been doing all this for years, right? But just with one particular company. Mm-hmm. And what was now really exciting was that I got the opportunity to do it with lots of different companies, right? As part of a consultancy, and also kind of guide people, and something that you can probably tell, right? I'm really passionate about, and I love that. I love looking at like the problem, helping people, and then that for me the cherry on top is always that when you see the end product and the result, right? And you can literally like walk away and feel really good that actually, can you remember when that client was literally at ground zero, and now they've got this whole shiny kind of Salesforce instance. So sorry, I know I've just very much diverted from your initial question, but yeah, I guess that's my kind of journey into Salesforce and my continuing journey in Salesforce.
No, it's okay. I love it though. I love that your natural passion comes out when you're answering the questions, and that's absolutely fine. So you're saying that the transition was an easy one from an end client to consulting. Would you say that you found it quite easy because of the skills that you picked up? Is there any difference? Anything surprised you at all?
Yeah, so I think I think everyone's probably going to have a slightly different journey, right? And I think for me, because I'm quite a people person, right? And what I admit, what I do is I heavily rely on that. So that's how I love to make the connections, right? So and I think consultancy, a lot of it is exactly that, right? It's making that connection, and like that's how you kind of build your trust with somebody, right? And you get that safe feeling and the trusted pair of hands. And I think, and I think naively I didn't realize that I already did that, right, previously. So I think that was probably why I felt it quite easy from that perspective. Where I think, to answer your question, Pei, where it probably was a challenge was, I think, some of the kind of, when I initially started, some of the big name clients that we had, right? And I think there was a bit of nervousness around that, because you'd sometimes turn up to meetings and you'd be a little bit, almost feel a little bit like imposter syndrome, right? It's like, wow, okay, they're asking, I'm like, what? Back then I was like, what? 29, 30 or whatever, right? And it's like, these clients are asking me for my opinion, right? So, I would say, but there'd always be that element where you think, well, say if I say something that's not right? Or say if I advise on something that's not right. So I think there was a little bit of pressure around that. And I guess something that we all find a little bit challenging anyway with Salesforce, even now, is that there's so much of it, and there's so much functionality, that what I've learned to live with now is that actually you're not going to know the A to Z of every single thing about Salesforce, right? And I think back then, if I was to tell my, previous self, it would be, that's okay, right? But I think, again, naively back then, I would think, oh no, but say if they ask me about forecasting in reports, I haven't got a clue, right? to be fair, slight secret, I still haven't got a clue, right? but you know what I mean? And I think back then I would kind of get quite worried that, say, if this comes up but I don't know. Whereas now, I think it's realistic, right, to think that you're not going to know the A to Z, and you can take it away and investigate. And actually, that's the fun part, because you can take it away and you can actually say, I spent a couple of days looking at that, and this is what I think. This is how I think Salesforce might kind of help you.
No, that's really good. There's a lot to unpack there. So if you allow me to do so, and if you've strayed into a territory that I find really fascinating, in something that I've been talking about just recently, which is around emotional intelligence, especially around consulting. And it sounds like this is a skill that you already had. And when you used the phrase earlier on, if I might paraphrase, you said you leaned very heavily on the fact that you're a people person to kind of get by in the consulting world when you transition. And then you went on to say, well, actually, that's the biggest part of it. I think this is something that I agree very strongly, that what makes us truly and deeply successful in what we do is the people part of it. And not just for consulting, but I think that's true of any role. The connection and safety, as you're talking about, that you create with your client and with your team allows you and everyone around you to achieve so much more. And the competence or the ability or the knowledge bit is important, but not as important as what a lot of people think. Mm-hmm. So just, going in from that, I'm just going to stray out a little bit, and I'll bring it back into what you were talking about. Just if you look at the job descriptions for Salesforce nowadays, why do you think that such a big emphasis is on the hard skills, all the things you must know, and the soft skills, which are so critically important, is right at the bottom as an afterthought, like, being able to work well with teams, able to be responsible, blah, blah, blah. But it's a few one-liners. Why do you think there's still an emphasis on hard skills over soft skills?
Yeah, I think, again, I think a part of it is like, it's like that comfort. I think that as I guess recruiters or people that deal with resourcing, I think it's like having that comfort that people know about the product. And I think a lot of it is on that, right? And I guess as the years have gone by, especially the last, I guess, 3 to 4 years, there's been a huge increase in certifications as well, right? And there's been an emphasis around really knowing the product, right? But I mentioned the certifications because what I found, Pei, is that sometimes that's not it though, right? So you can have somebody that might have 25 certifications, right? And you'll think, brilliant, this person is going to be fantastic, right? And then actually, when you kind of get into a conversation with them, it turns out that they are very much textbook, right? And then when you try to kind of delve into the consultancy aspect, that's where, to your point, Pei, the things that you were mentioning at the bottom of that list, that's where you suddenly start seeing that the application of that isn't happening, right? So it is all very textbook. I do think it's primarily because people want to have that comfort that people know the product. But I think the bit that people sometimes aren't realizing is that in order to apply the knowledge, you need to have all of the other skill set as well. So you could know it all in your head, yeah, and you could be Einstein, right? No pun intended, right? So you could be Einstein, right? But if you can't then apply it and speak Salesforce to potentially a person that has never heard of it before, right? I think that's where sometimes on paper stuff like that is missed, right? Because it's a challenge, right? It's very hard to kind of formulate that and put it into a bullet point, right? It's almost like saying the X factor or the, you can't really say that. And I think that's why sometimes on paper, particularly when you look at job roles, etc., somebody can just read that as communication skills and that'll be it, right? And if I saw that, I'd be like, wow, that is such an oversight to communication skills. If I ever saw somebody just have good communication skills, right? It's all about perception, right? Somebody could walk away and think good communication skills means I can just read off a page and that's it, right? And then another person might actually think, no, good communication skills is, how do you get that trust? How do you, take a client on that journey, right? And so, yeah, I think on paper, to your point, Pei, is I think the perception sometimes that's where it can get a bit confusing, right? And people read that bullet point and just think, yeah, I've got good communication skills because that's all it said, right? And there's no elaboration of actually what is good communication, right?
Absolutely. I think that's doing a disservice both to the candidate and to the company itself, because it's so much more, I think, that makes a consultant. I like the fact that you said X factor. I didn't think about it in that terms before, but you're right. There's something that is very difficult to articulate in terms of what makes a really good consultant. You also mentioned imposter syndrome. So I've spoken to quite a few people on my podcast, quite a few directors at Salesforce, and this is something they mention as well. And I don't think it escapes us. I feel that anyone who encounters this feeling are actually very conscientious and care very deeply about the quality of the work that they produce. And if anyone don't feel like that, they've either reached the pinnacle of being incredibly self-aware, or they're just not that good as they think they are. So
and to be fair, Pei, something that I only realized probably end of last year, start of this year, so I'll wholeheartedly admit this, right? Being completely honest, is that imposter, how to deal with the imposter kind of syndrome situations, is something that the penny only dropped like very early this year, where I had a bit of coaching, right? And the kind of result of that coaching was actually exactly how you've just said, Pei. It's not like it's not a bad thing. It's actually, somebody is actually thinking it through. It shows that somebody is actually thinking it through, kind of milestoning it in the head. Yeah. And also it's what you do next that counts. So even if you do get it, it's like, okay, it's there, but so what, right? It's like, if you let it affect you, it's ways of managing it, right? That is actually what you might need to do. So having it there, I don't think is an issue.
How do you manage it, Tom?
So I have my internal voice, and I manage it by actually turning it around and saying, okay, so why have you flagged this? And is there anything that you might need to just highlight back, as a one-liner, just to kind of, make sure that, you're aligned, or, just do that kind of temperature check, right? So if, your body's obviously, alarmed you for a reason, so do a temperature check, yeah? And then normally I kind of do the internal voice and just say, no, it's just because, you're being a bit too cautious in your mind. So carry on, you're on the right track, you're the trusted one, etc. Right? So I do use a lot of my internal voice usually to kind of deal with it.
Excellent stuff. Just extending what you were saying about how you felt. You said you felt you had that imposter syndrome as when you first started, and you were in meetings with big clients, big logos, and felt like, they're asking for my advice. And I think when I first started out, it was a bit like that. And also the fact that there's a question in my head, am I good enough to play with the big boys as well? There's that in my head. But from the experience that I've had is that every company have their own issues at the same time. There's still, how I think to myself is, even if I was speaking to the queen, she still has to wear, does she wear trousers? I'm sure she does, right?
I'm sure she does at some point in her day.
She still has to put one foot in before the other, just like the rest of us. Absolutely. And I think for me, that's a way that I deal with it. And I've had some meetings with people who've been who I felt was out of my league. And that's how I kind of deal with my imposter syndrome. Oh my goodness, I shouldn't be here. They're all really bigwigs. But when you talk to them, they're still kind of able to, they're not as intimidating as my voice told me beforehand. So
absolutely.
Thank you for letting me share that. So we've done projects together, and we've also done projects outside in our experience. And we're now on a topic that I am really passionate about. Can you share with me, you don't have to give names or anything like that, some projects that have been truly character building, that you've taken some lessons away from it because it was quite challenging or it was very tough in different ways? Are there some stories you can tell us about that?
Yeah, absolutely. So I guess one of them was around a kind of utilities client that we had. And again, right, so they were very new to Salesforce, and it was, a new client that we had as well, a kind of new logo, so to speak. And I think for that particular one, it was getting the kind of buy-in and the alignment, right, which is really key. So what we always should have in kind of larger implementations is that you want a kind of specified product owner, right, who is kind of empowered into be that decision maker, right? And as I guess a consultancy, we are assisting them in that journey, and they might have never have done it before, right? In most cases they probably haven't, right? But we're there to kind of guide them, and I think one of those experiences was the fact that there was the lack of that ownership, right? And then it's almost became like a bit like too many cooks, right? Because on kind of these larger scale implementations, it's absolutely key that you have somebody that the kind of buck stops with, right? Who can then basically say, when there's like 7 or 8 people's kind of requirements, and everyone is saying my requirement is the best one, no, my requirement is the best one, right? You need somebody that can basically take the kind of executive decision and say, actually, all your requirements are great, but I'm actually going to take A, B, and C first, and then we'll do D, E, and F, right? And that's it, right? Decision made. And I think that was a really good example of where we didn't have that, and then there were a lot of challenges. We had identified that we needed that person, got that person in, collaborated with them, coached them, and the end result was actually, after 9-10 months, implementation was really well, and they had a really high uptake of Salesforce. So I guess that's one that springs to mind. Character building for me, I think having to kind of deal with lots of different people with, I guess, strong opinions. So for me, it was literally, I mean, I have to admit, sometimes I just felt like man in the middle, right? And I think that's what a lot of functional roles usually are, right? But this one felt so much that I was a man in the middle all the time. And I was, going in between different teams. But great character building, really good experience. At the end of it, did lots of hours as well, weekend working, all of that stuff, right? Which at the time, was a bit of a challenge. But after you look at the 9-10 months, it's something that I still go back to now and think, actually, how did I deal with that situation? Let's go back, and kind of just think about how we could apply that for the better in future roles, I guess.
You used an interesting phrase. I'd like to flesh it out a bit more. When you say man middle as a functional consultant, can you just provide some context and some more examples for the listeners, please?
Yeah, absolutely. So what's really important, I guess, in the functional space is that you need to be able to collaborate with various stakeholders, right? Now, those can be directly with a business, right? People that will not know anything to do with Salesforce, right? So you need to be able to, get requirements from said people, yeah? Be able to kind of understand them from a business perspective, but then you apply what I call like the Salesforce filter on, right? So then you start to kind of augment them into how will this look in Salesforce, right? So that's the first kind of, I think that's the first key part where you are the person in the middle, right? Because what you're then doing is you're kind of potentially going to a Salesforce architect or a Salesforce tech team, yeah? And you're actually saying, right, these are the requirements. This is what I think a solution could look like out of box, yeah? What is your kind of guidance on this? What are the dependencies, etc., right? What are the risks of doing this way, right? So straight away there, you have that, you're in the middle, right? Because you've got your business and then you've got architects and technical teams, right? So from an initial solution perspective, you are the person that's then going to have to speak with the architect to make sure that they understand exactly what the requirement is. But then you have to go back to the client and go, hello, Mr. or Mrs. Business, right? This is how Salesforce is going to look for you, and look, your requirements have been fulfilled, and look, it's adding that business value, right? So I guess that's the kind of first part. Secondary to that is there are other teams as well involved, particularly in larger implementations of Salesforce, which are, for example, once a solution has been made, then you might have a whole development team. And sometimes that development team is in a different country, right? And then after that development team, the solution might get tested. And then you might have a whole testing team, right? And again, that testing team might not be in the same country. So again, you've now got another two teams where the functional role is so critical, because you're primarily doing the same thing, right? You're relaying requirements, solution to particular teams, right? But the way in which you orchestrate that back to that team, you almost have to be a chameleon, right? Because you have to use a slightly different skill, slightly different way of communicating, right? Because with a technical team, you might have to actually go a little bit further under the bonnet, right? And talk a little bit more about Salesforce, which you wouldn't do back to the client, right? You would never say to a client, I've built this particular item in a process builder, and I remember to check that little flag that checks back that it's not clashing with it, because the client would basically say, that's pointless information for me, right? But that's something that you might have to mention to a technical team, and you'd probably would mention it to an architect, because we all know architects want to have that bird's eye view, right? So I guess, it's being that kind of chameleon, I guess, making sure you know who your audience is very key, I think, to being a successful functional consultant.
You've just made my mind just ping to so many different directions with what you just said. No, don't be sorry. It just actually means that we need part 2 of the podcast, because I can't fit all my questions in,
no worries.
in this one. But if you allow me to indulge my curiosity here, one of my very favorite topics is around methodologies. And I know that at Capgemini, you've worked on medium to really large projects. One of the things that I've always kind of said is that methodology is fine. So waterfall is fairly outdated in the way that it was practiced with Prince. Pure Agile works in some situations, and the examples that come to mind are if you're a product company like Salesforce potentially, and you are incrementally and continuously providing value through releases. However, from a consulting engagement point of view, it kind of has to be a hybrid, is my opinion. But I'm always open to being wrong. So I know that at CAP, I hadn't had the opportunity when I was there to work on any of the large scale projects that were scaled Agile, for example. Have you been involved in any of these sort of projects that has been Agile in the way that it's been conceived, or were they more hybrid? That's what I like to hear.
Yeah, so it's probably more of a hybrid, I would have thought, with a lot of Agile, flavor to it, right? So I think what works really well, and what has worked on some of the larger scale implementations, is the part where you build, test, deploy, right? So that kind of piece, or I should kind of say build, test, kind of playback, right? So that kind of piece, I think, works really well in that kind of with that Agile mindset. And a lot of the kind of successful projects, if I think about them, they've had that kind of loop, right, where you've got a set of requirements that have been shaped really well, got some really good acceptance criteria that's been augmented correctly with the client, product owner, very key, like I said before. Once that bit's done, I think the build, kind of test and deploy part, that bit I would say is the bit of that I find that, I think, from the Agile perspective, very, very key, and something that has been used in our engagements to success, because you want to have that, you want to be able to increment on a build, right? You want to be able to showcase, and you want to be able to show value back to a business quite quickly, right? To kind of say, actually, look, this was part of the problem, this was part of the problem statement, but within 2 months, actually, this piece of functionality is actually going to solve quite a large chunk of what your problem statement was. And so look at the business value. And I think that's really important, particularly in the kind of market that we, or I guess the world that we live in today, right? We have so much choice, right? When you go into a supermarket, etc., there's so much choice. But I think we've become a society where we want the quick wins, right? We want instant, right? We want to press the button. It's like the vending machine mentality, right? We literally, see the vending machine, and we look at the item, and then straight away, product in hand, and we run away, right? Without really happy with our product in hand. And I think from an implementation perspective, I think that's what a lot of businesses want. And I think what Agile allows you to do is really showcase that.
I fully embrace that concept because, as you say, when they see the value, then you get the buy-in, and it's quite a lovely virtuous cycle. Where I'm trying to get to is a couple of things. One is, I think, so I just want perspective on this from a consulting engagement point of view. Those build, test, and deploy iterations are wrapped with a discovery upfront and an overarching planning, especially if it's an enterprise program where you've got multiple partners and potentially quite a big UAT or testing at the end before a full-blown deployment. Whereas internally, you could have that small BDT iterations to show the improvements. So that's kind of where I want to get to. I feel that for larger implementation, it's quite hard to hold on to the principles of, one of the principles of Agile is they welcome change at every stage. And sometimes I feel changes have cost impact and it ripples through. So you might have your iteration now, and if they change their minds later on, to make that corrections elsewhere, it might accrue more technical debt.
Yeah.
So do you still see that in the large implementation, or is there something I'm missing in how they implement it where you don't get that situations at all?
Yeah, so absolutely, Pay. So it is a challenge to kind of work with that hybrid model. But I think there's two things there, right? So the first thing is the bit I mentioned around having those fully augmented kind of requirements, acceptance criteria, making sure that your product owner is completely on board, right? So that is absolutely key to have before you go into a build, right? The other thing is what there should be an upfront definition around 0 to about 5% around the change element that you mentioned, right? So it should be, you can do some tweaks, but it can't be, going from a square to a circle, right? Perhaps you might make the square into a rectangle, maybe, right? But it can't become a circle, right? So I think those two things are very key. But I agree with you, Pei. On larger scale implementations, it can be a challenge if you don't have that, right? Because then what you don't want to have is that what you said at the start with all your requirements ends up actually being like, a number of CRs, a number of change requests at the end, because actually the requirements have suddenly just become a completely different beast, right? To what you originally thought. But I would say again that from a governance perspective, it would be silly not to have those checkpoints, right? Throughout the months, because you can't in all realistic, purposes go from one beast to another, right? it might have just got tweaked along the way slightly, but it can't be two different things. So I would question the governance on those types of programs if it did become something completely different, because surely in like month 2 or 3, you should have clocked on that this isn't what we originally thought, right? And that's when, I know from your project experience, Pay, that's when you would replan, right? Because the plan's not going right. So that's when you'd start replanning. I think what would be what would be the biggest challenge, and not particularly a great experience, is like if you only found that out without any alarm bells, like from month 1 to like month 9, that wouldn't really be a great experience, I don't think.
Thank you for that, actually, because you've added a couple more, you've added a lot more context that allows me to frame that in my mind in a better way. So the two things that you've mentioned are basically more solid requirements that are based on a tighter collaboration with product owner in the business to solidify what they really want. You talked about well-developed user stories and really solid and accurate acceptance criteria.
Yeah.
And that's key. I think a lot of people don't do that well enough. And a lot of people think, or they understand Agile in a very surface, in a very shallow manner, and just take the 12 principles at face value. Oh, I can change my mind next week. I can change the data type, or I can change different fields that I want, and etc. And not realizing there's so much impact on data migration and integration and so on and so forth. And as you say, potentially change the beast without that sort of clarity. So one was really tight understanding of the requirements. And secondly, I want to say governance, but it wasn't governance. It was something else.
Yeah. Secondly, it was the, I'm trying to think what I actually said. Secondly, it was being able to
we've lost now. I'm gonna go look at the transcript. But I think that's it. It's just really understanding of what the requirements are, isn't it?
Yeah,
the problem
absolutely.
definition.
Yeah, absolutely.
Got it. So secondly, it was the allowance of change between 0 to 5%.
Oh yes, yeah, absolutely, yeah. Something around that, because you need to, you can do the tweaks, but you need to have a boundary, right? And where I mentioned about square potentially becoming a rectangle, but it can't become a circle, right?
So if it was that way, I think that there was a problem right in front in identifying what the issues were.
Yeah, absolutely.
You know what? I was having so much fun, and I just looked at the time, and I want to be very mindful and very respectful. I have a whole bunch of questions that I want to get into. Would it be okay to have a part 2?
Yeah, absolutely.
Oh, I would love that so much. There's quite a lot of things. Just to delve into your current role and how you got here and what shaped your values, which are the things that I find most fascinating and interesting. But for today, thank you so much. Like I said, I hadn't realized the time. I just really enjoyed it so much. Thank you for sharing us part of your journey, which we'll go into in a second session at some point when you're able to make some time for me. So I appreciate the opportunity to talk to you, Tokeer. I've missed you quite a bit.
Brilliant. Thank you, Pay. Thanks very much for having me on. It's really great to speak to you again.